Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this CCTL Comparative Constitutional Law Research Forum book talk on filtering populist claims to fight populism, the Italian case in a comparative perspective, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. Here's the book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. We're going to hear a lot about it soon. As you will see, it's a fascinating case study, not just about populism and constitutionalism in Italy, but about the kind of concept of populism and sort of how it's developed and how populists kind of make use of constitutionalism for their own ends and how the rest of us can fight back. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. We have two speakers, terrific speakers with us today. Let me briefly introduce them. Both of them are leading scholars of comparative constitutional law. First, the author of this book, Professor Giuseppe Martinico, who is full professor of comparative public law at the Scuola Superiore, Sant'Anna, Pisa. Sorry for my Italian pronunciation. He's the author of many books and articles in both Italian and English, including in leading journals such as the German Law Journal, European Public Law, and European Constitutional Law. We are also very pleased to be joined by Professor Antonia Baraggia, who is an associate professor of comparative constitutional law at the University of Milan Law School. She too has published widely in both Italian and English, also again in leading publications like the Cambridge Journal of International and Comparative Law and the Vienna Journal of International Constitutional Law. So thank you both very much for joining us today. Let me give a brief rundown of the program. So Professor Martinico will speak first, introducing the book. This will be followed by comments from Professor Baraggia. We will then have a question and answer session. So if members of the audience, if you have questions or comments, please send those to me via the chat function and I will pose them to the speakers. So with that, let's get started. Giuseppe, could I invite you to present the book, please?
Thanks indeed. Hello, everyone. It is indeed a great honor for me, to be with you, although virtually. And I'm gonna share my presentation in order to make this hopefully, clear and quick. So, can you see my slides? I guess so. But
yes, we can.
Okay, great, awesome. So I'm also going to use my stopwatch. All right. I want to thank Ryan, of course, for inviting me and the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. It means a lot to me. Thanks so much. So these are the cover and the table of contents of my book. This book is the outcome of a research itinerary started almost 7 years ago. I remember that in 2016, Luigi Corrias published a very seminal article in the European Constitutional Law Review, in which he pointed out the lack of interest of constitutional law scholars and constitutional law theorists in the topic of populism. Of course, much has changed in recent years, in which we have had the proliferation and mushrooming of articles and volumes in this ambit. So why did I write this book? Because I noticed that the still prevailing political science literature in this ambit often ends up conceiving constitutional law as a sort of codification of power relations, losing this way the normative meaning of the concept of constitutionalism. Another reason why I wrote this book is that I think that the constitutional law scholars should go beyond a mere defensive approach when dealing with populism. Indeed, the constitutionalism is more than a mere series of constraints, since it performs other functions as well. For instance, facilitating a transition from the multitude to the people contributing to the creation of the identity of the constitutional subject, as Rosenfeld powerfully wrote it. So my research perspective. So I'm interested in how populists in power use categories of constitutional theory, for instance, democracy, the constituent power, and instruments of constitutional law, the referendum. The populist approach to constitutional categories can be described, in my view, in light of two strategies used by populists, mimetism and parasitism. Parasitism is not a new concept in the field of studies on populism. Nadia Urbinati, Benjamin Arditi, and recently also Theo Fournier used this analogy to describe how populism in a way can affect the equilibria of constitutional democracy. Mimetism instead here describes, I would say, how populist leaders endeavor to present themselves as consistent and compatible with the language of constitutionalism. In other words, how they hide behind the words of the Constitution in order to legitimize themselves and their claims. And I'm gonna offer some examples of mimetism in a couple of minutes. So in this book, basically, I try to analyze the relationship between constitutionalism and populism, looking at the Italian case. However, this is not just a book about Italy, because the Italian case has been treated as an emanation of a broader phenomenon, what I call post-totalitarian constitutionalism, what we call in Europe post-totalitarian constitutionalism. And there is indeed, in my view, a particular tension between populism and post-totalitarian constitutionalism, which is a particular kind of constitutionalism which has been enriched, I mean, by counter-majoritarian instruments, eternity clauses, entrenchment clauses, and new forms of strong judicial review of legislation. So in the very first part of the book, I tried to clarify why the Italian case is important to study the relationship between constitutionalism and populism. Italy has been a lab for those interested in studying populism, for those interested in analyzing the coexistence of multiple populisms, as a Blocher and Anselmi said. And the country has a long-lasting tradition of anti-parliamentarism over the course of its history. After the end of World War II, populism characterized many of the new parties and movements that came to the forefront in Italian politics. For instance, members of the Common Man's Front, the Fronte dell'Uomo Qualunque, which is probably the first populist, which has been the first populist movements in Italy, participated in the work of the Constituent Assembly. They were members of the Constituent Assembly of Italy. And after 2018, Italy became the first European country in which two self-styled populist forces, the Five Star Movement and the League, two forces with very different agendas and very different voting constituencies, formed the coalition government, which then ended in September 2019. Finally, another reason to study Italy is given by the fact that the country is a founding member of the European communities, now the European Union. And this is very relevant since in the book, I also deal with populist sovereignism in chapter 3. So I'm also interested in this kind of sovereignism, which combines nativism with, of course, I mean, the use and the instrumentalization of the moral argument. So in this respect, this volume offers the perspective of a constitutional lawyer coming from continental Europe. So having clarified that, let's move to some concrete examples of mimetism and parasitism. An example of the mimetic approach used by populists is a speech given by the, at that time, Italian Premier Giuseppe Conte at the United Nations in 2018. And at that time, he was a premier of a coalition government based on the alliance between the League and the Five Star Movement. On that occasion, and this is the official translation into English, the speech is said, when some accuse us of sovereignism or populism, I always enjoy pointing out that Article 1 of the Italian Constitution cites sovereignty and the people. And through that provision, I'm going to interpret these two concepts. So here, one can see, in my view, the attempt made by populists to find a reading consistent with the text of the Italian Constitution by stretching at the same time some of its key concepts, and most importantly, exercising a sort of cherry-picking approach to the constitutional language. Indeed, when referring to Article 1 of the Italian Constitution, populists tend to mention only a part of the relevant provision, the part recognizing the principle of popular sovereignty, in order to find confirmation of their majoritarian approach to the constitution, and in order to reinforce the dichotomy between themselves, the people voted by the people, so the real people, and the others. They don't refer indeed to the question of constitutional limits, to the subject of the chains of constitutionalism, so to say. So indeed, and this is the actual provision of Article 1 of the Italian Constitution, populists, when approaching this article, tactically on purpose omit that the same Article 1 of the Italian Constitution clarifies, I would say immediately in the text, the popular sovereignty should be understood as limited by the Constitution itself, as the provision reads, a popular sovereignty is exercised in the forms and within the limits of the Constitution. This approach is very telling of how populism, in the plural, try to legitimize themselves as a political force is consistent with the constitutional language. And when they do so, they also advance a sort of alternative reading of the constitutional concept, of course, enshrined in this norm. In this sense, they advance a constitutional counter-narrative. But this is one of the claims you can find in my book, relying on the ambiguity of this constitutional law concept. Another example is a very famous speech given by Orban, in which democracy was deprived of its liberal component. And this brings us back to parasitism, which refers to how populists alter the equilibria in the constellation of values characterizing constitutional democracy. So in so doing, the person democracy understood as the mere rule of majority, as a sort of trump card which should prevail over other constitutional values, including, of course, the rule of law. Now, so far we have seen how populists use the mimetic approach with the reference to some provisions of national constitution, but the same pattern can be applied to the provisions of the European treaties, if you want. And indeed, the European treaties have been defined by the Court of Justice of the European Union as the constitutional charter of the EU. This case, I think, is a perfect example of that. This is a judgment of the Hungarian Constitutional Court, which, as you know, has been captured by the regime of Viktor Orban, in which the Hungarian Constitutional Court used one of the provisions of the Treaty of the European Union, Article 4.2, the article stating the duty to respect national identities of the member state. They used this article in order to justify the violation of the values of the European Union and of the general principles governing fundamental rights. Let's look at the language, let's look at the words employed by the Hungarian Constitutional Court in this case. They first referred to the wording of Article 4.2, which, by the way, uses the plural national identities. Then they understood these national identities as a constitutional identity. Third, they understood constitutional identity as Hungary's self-identity. And then they coupled the respect of national identity with the respect of sovereignty. Now, make no mistake, sovereignty is a word that you cannot find in the actual text of Article 4.2. So, in so doing, the Hungarian Constitutional Court completely disregarded the fact that in Article 4 of the Treaty of the European Union, national identities must be read in system in conjunction with the concept of sincere cooperation. And indeed, they use the concept of national identity in a very unilateral manner, justifying the non-compliance of Hungary with the values of the Union, Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, and the fundamental rights governed by Article 6 of the Treaty of the European Union. This is parasitism in action. So they alter the equilibria behind the design of the European treaties by understanding identity in a very static manner. As they wrote, national identity, constitutional identity should be read in light of the achievements of our historical constitution. So the Hungarian Constitutional Court, first of all, claimed to have the last say over what constitutional identity is. And second thing, they also operated a sort of Copernican revolution. Indeed, they gave this background. The primacy of EU law becomes an exception. It is not the rule. They also use the Zolange argument in order to make this point. So this kind of reading is obviously unacceptable, and it is based on an evident manipulation and mimetic interpretation of the norm. Now, of course, this is not the only approach followed by populists in this ambit, and with my research, I don't claim to exclude other possible strategies. For instance, even in established democracies, populists have sometimes followed a confrontational approach. And these are some examples taken from the US, in which former President Trump defined the US the Constitution as an archaic system. For instance, something like that can be found in Italy as well. Think of Berlusconi, for instance. Unfortunately, shame of us, he was a pioneer in this respect. He attacked the Italian constitution, saying that it had been written under the influence of the Soviet Union. However, what I would like to say in my book is that while constitutional law scholars so far have focused mainly on the phenomenon of unconstitutional to constitutional amendments or on the abuse of emergency power, which are important phenomena, in my view, these are just the tip of the iceberg. That's why in establishing the democracies, the erosion of the majoritarian chains of constitutionalism often occurs in a more subtle manner, and that's why I focused on mimetism and parasitism in my book. Now, from a methodological point of view, one of the greatest difficulties I encountered at the beginning of my research was how to deal with immense literature on the concept of populism. Populism, or rather populisms in the plural, are characterized by constitutive ambiguity. And that's why I took a different path. So instead of trying to define a priori what populism is, I tried to proceed by identifying some elements, some ingredients, if you want, of populism that are of particular interest to constitutional law scholars. And these are extreme majoritarianism, identity politics, and politics of immediacy. Starting with extreme majoritarianism, indeed, populists understand constitution as straitjackets and as obstacles to the fulfillment of the real democracy, the will of the people. And in so doing, they create another false dichotomy. They are very good at creating these false dichotomies that between democracy and constitutionalism. So how do populists attack the constitution in this context? They attack the constitution by rehabilitating the concept of constituent power. So here you can see how instrumental their use of these constitutional law categories is. They literally steal our words and concepts. And indeed, as Andrea Arato said, they implicitly claim the absolute prevalence of the constituent power over the constitution. So against this background, the constituent power becomes a vehicle of legal resentment, and it also becomes an instrument to challenge the constraints of constitutionalism. So probably the idea so widespread among lawyers of a constituent power as a pure power operating in a legally empty spaces due to Kashmir, who famously, if you want, manipulated the original idea of CUHK. And here you can find another evidence of the Schmittian flavor of populism. As Zarato said, populism occupies the space of constituent power in its permanent mobilization, and this is how populists use this concept to justify their permanent political campaign. And so the alleged dichotomy between constitutionalism and democracy returns, cyclically returns. So this debate could lead us back to the exchange between Jefferson and Madison about the right of every generation to give itself a constitution. But if I were asked to find an intellectual reference for this dichotomy between constitutionalism and democracy, I would mention the works by Antonio Negri, starting with this book, Insurgencies, the Constituent Power and the Modern State, which is a true compendium of a Jacobin constitutional theory applied to contemporary law. His ideas has been also regained more recently by the theories of Joel Colorios, who wrote an important book on weak constitutionalism. And indeed, in my view, for populists, the only acceptable form of constitutionalism is a weak version of it. In other words, a type of constitutionalism which opens up to the claims of a sort of permanent constituent power. However, this kind of concept does not correspond to what we have in mind when referring to post-totalitarian constitutionalism in Europe. My second element, my second ingredient, if you want, is identity politics. Nadia Urbinati and many other political theorists explain the transformative function carried out by populism, stressing that it claims to determine the purposefully constitutional inclusive notion of the people by depicting the popular subject as a unitary and exclusionary concept. Now, identity politics is often codified in constitution. I mean, think of article letter R.4 of the Hungarian Basic Law, according to which, I'm quoting, the protection of the constitutional identity and Christian culture of Hungary shall be an obligation of every organ of the state. Another striking example is provided by the Russian constitution. If I'm not mistaken, it's Article 67, which reads, I'm quoting again, the Russian Federation honors the memory of defenders of the fatherland, provides protection of the historical truth, Diminution of the heroic deed of the people defending the fatherland is precluded. This is the wording of the Russian constitution. So these provisions are very telling of this progressive weaponization of constitutional law and of the constitutionalization of the image of the enemy, if you want. In this sense, these values that have been codified in these constitutions are used against those who are not part of the real people. And you can see here the seeds of a sort of identitarian public law, which makes an instrumental use of the moral argument, of the religious argument, and of the historical argument. Now, the populist leader, according to this constitutional counter-narrative, is not only seen as the source of morality, but also as the source of official truth. And this is what Nadia Urbinati called objectocracy. So those who dare to question the truth of the leader are seen again as enemies of the people. I mean, see the confrontation about the vaccine between Trump and Fauci, or see what happened in Brazil with Bolsonaro. The third element I took into account is politics of immediacy, which is a beautiful formula coined by Luigi Corrias, as far as I know. He referred to a kind of politics which rejects the idea of mediation offered by representative institutions. This again confirms that populism aims to construct a constitutional counter-narrative by using constitutional theory concept, and also reveals the anti-pluralist understanding of democracy endorsed by populists. And this leads me to the fascinating debate about the noble and the risky nature of referendums and about their compatibility with representative democracy. In those systems, such as the United Kingdom, where the constitution failed to play the role of a risk management device, the impact of the referendum over representative institutions has been devastating, as we know. And another emanation of this politics of immediacy is the return of the debate about the imperative mandate in Europe. I'm going to say something about that in a minute. So this is my last slide. What should we do, right? I think that, as I said at the beginning of my talk, we should go beyond a mere defensive approach. The fact that, in my opinion, populism and post-totalitarian constitutionalism are incompatible does not imply denying the possibility of using some of the proposals put forward by populists, provided that we manage to filter these proposals, making them compatible with the untouchable core of post-totalitarian constitutionalism. In this sense, in my book, I try to make a distinction between populism as such, or structural populism, and populist claims that could be pushed forward by either populist or non-populist forces. This distinction is the outcome of a contamination, if you want the political language, which has induced even non-populist forces to sometimes make populist arguments in order to compete with them. So this is, of course, a negative consequence of this new wave of populism. But how should we filter out populist claims? I give you some examples. I have 3 examples. So the first one has to do with techno-populism. Techno-populists have a point when they insist on the potential of the internet for the democracy of tomorrow. New technologies also offer interesting ideas for redefining the relationship between democracy and constitutionalism. In Italy, during the pandemic, the parliament has been really marginal because its members cannot vote remotely. And this makes no sense, I mean, with today's technology. So the internet is a political resource. It can be used to reinforce representative democracy as well, but careful sailor, because the populist option of overriding the role of parliaments is not compatible with democracy as such, because it would produce a very kind of form of instantaneous democracy, as Ming Sun Kuo, I mean, powerfully wrote, killing this way deliberation, which is an essential component of democracy. My second example has to do with the transfugism, which is the constant changes of political affiliation and groups of the members of the parliament. Populists are right when they say that transfugism can be seen as a problem and even as an indication of corruption. But how can we remedy that? The return of the imperative mandate is not an option. At least in Europe, as the Venice Commission said, the free parliamentary mandate is a pillar of European constitutionalism. It guarantees the role of parliament. So a prohibition of the imperative mandate cannot be overcome. Comparative law in this respect offers other solutions. For instance, the Portuguese model, Article 160 of the Portuguese Constitution, which introduces a very sophisticated anti-defection clause, which does not automatically imply the loss of the seat. This is an example of how we can strike a balance, I mean, trying to preserve the untouchable core of constitutionalism, but at the same time, I mean, by enriching representative democracy. My final example is about the referendum. One of the political battles of the First movement has been that to annul the so-called participation quorum for non-constitutional referendums in order to make up for the low turnout at the latest rounds of consultations. Now, the participation quorum is a safeguard to impede a low majority of voters from repealing a law passed by a broad majority in parliament. So if eliminating the participation quorum does not make any sense in my view, we could, however, reflect on the possibility of lowering such a quorum. These are just examples. In my book, I try to come up with other examples, and you can find my thought there. But my idea, and this is my conclusion, is that participation, if coupled with deliberation, is a key to overcoming passivity. So instead of giving the people the illusion of making decisions for themselves by replacing representative institutions, we should channel criticism, transforming, as Alberto Alemanno said, this mounting distrust into an active democratic virtue. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Giuseppe. You really covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, so much appreciated. Can I now turn to Professor Antonio Baraggia for your comments, please?
Yes, hello, can you hear me properly?
Yes, hear you well.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for this invitation to comment on Giuseppe's book, which is an extraordinarily relevant book in the current debate on populism in a comparative perspective. And I would like to stress this aspect. So this is a book on comparative law. So it's not a book on the Italian way of populism. Of course, it zooms in the Italian case, but it offers more broadly an overview of populism under a continental Europe perspective, which is a perspective that is not so common when looking at populism, because basically continental Europe is made of what we call consolidated democracy. So there is maybe a presumption that they are less prone to be affected by populist forces, but as the Italian case shows, also consolidated democracy can offer a ground for populist movement. So while the populist literature has often covered the US case, for example, of Latin America cases, and of course the Eastern countries in Europe with Hungary and Poland, less attention has been paid to continental Europe. So I think that this is an extraordinarily important book that focuses on continental tradition in Europe, and shows how even the post-war paradigm, so the post-totalitarian paradigm of constitutionalism, can be fragile vis-a-vis this tension that are brought by populist movement. This book is also important under a theoretical point of view, because especially in the first chapter, but also during the thematic chapter that follows the first one, Giuseppe developed a theory of populism. And it does so putting and also arguing a clear point. So a kind of oxymoron relationship between populism and constitutionalism. This is an important perspective, because in my view, it gives us food for thought to reconfigure the relation between democracy and constitutionalism. This is today especially a a contested relation. Also, if we look at so the tension between constitutionalism and democracy in the global perspective, there are several authors that recently have argued about this tension between democracy and constitutionalism. And what is clear reading Giuseppe's book is that the tension between democracy and constitutionalism creates a fertile soil for populist movement that take advantage of this tension, using the concept of constitutionalism in order to challenge the constitutional project from the inside. So in order to challenge the foundation of constitutionalism itself as a system of limited government. So there is this interesting relations between populists that works from the inside of the constitutional system to challenge the very same foundation of the constitutional order. And they do so, as Giuseppe clearly says, using strategies like mimetism and parasitism that has already been addressed. And we can also see these, particularly from the continental Europe perspective, if we look at the relationship between populist movement and the European Union, which is so a unique form of supranational order, which is put in relation with the constitutional order of the member state, and it is challenge, particularly by this populist movement. What is interesting is that, again, populist movement take a confrontational approach vis-a-vis the European Union, and in a sense, they take advantage of some flaws, of some criticism that we cannot say that they are not real flaws of the European Union. So the European Union has a lot of problems, starting from the technocratic turn of the EU, starting from the democratic disconnect of the EU. So these are problems that we all face when we study the European Union integration process. But what populist movement do is to stress this problem in order to adopt a confrontational approach and to challenge the whole European integration process as something that endanger the sovereignty, the identity of the member states. So they don't look for a relation vis-a-vis the European Union, but they adopt a confrontational approach, an oppositive approach. So, and in doing so, as the case of Hungary and Poland specifically show, they are challenging the future of the European Union as it is conceived by the treaty themselves. Another interesting aspect that Giuseppe has already mentioned is that populist movement manipulates, so use the same language of constitutionalism, but manipulates the concept and creates false dichotomy. So the dichotomy that we can see is the opposition between the people and the elite, between democracy and technocracy, between sovereignty and European values, for example. So it is interesting also to look at these false dichotomy that are stressed by populist movement. And as I said, this book is extremely important from a theoretical point of view, and I would like to highlight three different approaches that we can find in the literature with regard to the relationship between populism and constitutionalism. So the first one see a clear opposition between populism and constitutionalism. So this is something that cannot coexist. This is an oxymoron. You cannot speak about populism. You cannot speak about populist constitutional theory and constitutionalism. So they are incompatible. A second middle ground perspective claims that populism and constitutionalism share something. So, for example, they share the distrust in political power. And so it suggests that there is a ground of dialogue, of connection between populism and constitutionalism. Of course, populism use in an extreme way, for example, the revolutionary tradition that play an important role in the development of constitutionalism. The third conceptual framework that put populism and constitutionalism in relation is that of populist constitutionalism or constitutional populism. So the third stream of this debate consider populism as a manifestation of a particularly approach of constitutionalism itself. So there is no position, but populism is considered a particular manifestation, declination of constitutionalism. And clearly, Giuseppe challenged this argument. Even if Giuseppe is not so negative towards populism, in a sense that, as he clearly shows in the last chapter of the book, seen in studying the phenomenon of populism as a window of opportunity to address the problems that we cannot say that the liberal constitutionalism is not facing. So, but Giuseppe considered populism as a way to possibly address the problem experienced by constitutional order, legal order today. But of course, he says he don't agree about the possible configuration of populism within the tradition of constitutionalism. So I think that the book is really important under this theoretical perspective. So it clearly shows a different approach also for legal scholars in order to deal with populism. I end up with three questions after these comments. So the first one, and Giuseppe has already addressed it. So politics of immediacy, extreme majoritarianism as a feature of populism, put populism in tension with the use of direct democracy devices. So there are some scholarship today that stress the role of direct democracy, of referenda, of popular participation as also a way to address the democratic disconnect, democratic deficit of our system. But I would like to ask Giuseppe, how to reconcile the stress of on extreme majoritarianism and the potential, the positive role of this participatory device. And my last point is about the current Italian situation. So we had the election in which a new government has been elected, a right-wing government with some parties that were part also of the previous government, the Lega Nord, which is a sovereignist populist movement. So I would like to ask Giuseppe what will be be the future of Italian populism. So now that Lega Nord is in power, so it's part of the government, is this changing the agenda of this populist party, and how you can label the Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, so the right-wing party, can be considered a populist movement or just a right-wing movement. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion with you.
Thank you very much, Antonia. Giuseppe, would you like to make a quick response to those comments?
Okay, so, well, thanks so much, Antonia, for these very kind words, and thanks for your comments. Concerning the first part of your speech about the how populists, target the European Union, this is a very fascinating debate. Indeed, here we have what scholars called a populist sovereignism. Populism and sovereignism are not the same. They are autonomous concepts in theory, but sometimes they present a sort of overlap. Sovereignism can be defined as the claim of national sovereignty, which is not necessarily popular sovereignty, of course, against the dependence of domestic politics and domestic law on international constraints. Now, sovereignism presents different forms. We might have forms of identitarian, so right-wing sovereignism, and the forms of left-wing or some others, call them democratic sovereignism, but they share a lot. That both these forms of sovereignism look at the EU as a mere neoliberal creature, so as a sort of emanation of this globalization, of this neoliberal globalization that would represent a threat to the traditional values, and this is identitarian sovereignism, or BAM, for instance, or to the mission of welfare state seen as one of the achievements of post-totalitarian constitutionalism. And this is the essence of left-wing or democratic, as they call it, sovereignism. Now, I think that they are characterized by a lot of hermeneutics of suspicion. They see constitutional law as a part of a script in which, through the instrumentalization of constitutional law norms and to the instrumentalization of EU law norms, a sort of elite, would try to dictate the agenda. So I think that they conceive constitutionalism as a sort of device, as a dispositif, if one wants to use Foucault, as a sort of dispositif for depoliticizing and neutralizing social conflict that they see as the art of democracy. So in this sense, frequently these authors, or these populist leaders, look at constitutionalism as a sort of threat. Constitutionalism is dangerous since it will deprive politics of its mission. So, and this is, of course, something that I cannot accept, and that's why I'm so critical. And concerning your free approaches, I completely share this tripartition. I also try to come up with something similar, saying that there might be there is a group of scholars that we could trace back to a sort of group, according to which constitutionalism and populism are antithetical entities. So this is what I call the constitutionalism versus the populism. Then we have another group of scholars that the constitutionalism and the populism, in the sense that there is something which is shared. This sense of distrust is one of these things. Another element is the importance of emotions that can also play a fundamental role in the genesis of constitutions. And finally, we have those orders according to which constitutionalism, according to which populism can be seen as a form of constitutionalism. But I don't accept that, I mean, their view, since in my view they end up in frustrating the normative sense of the concept of constitutionalism. Concerning your questions, I think that the point on how to democratize constitutional law is crucial. I think that it is part of the mission of constitutionalism, that to make a genesis of the constitution and the ordinary life of the constitutional politics more and more transparent and open, and examples in comparative law are not missing. But again, I think that transparency shouldn't be treated as an absolute value. I mean, there are cases in which secrecy is a constitutional good. I mean, think of how constitutions govern the right to vote. So I'm very much in favor of this emphasis over transparency and openness, but sometimes we have to strike a balance in order to preserve deliberation, we'll say. But I know that there are different views on that. The latest book by Gargarella actually suggests that we should make constitutionalism more and more democratic, and I think it can be seen as a part of that literature, which in a way is questioning liberal constitutionalism as such. Finally, this government is a strong continuity for some aspect with the first two Conte governments. I see a lot of continuity. The League was also in the first, I mean, Conte government, and the League is, in my view, a populist force. Forza Italia is a populist force. Berlusconi is still there. Brothers of Italy, in my view, is instead a more traditional party, so I would say. So it's a traditional party which does not use so much the moral argument in order to distinguish between the real people and the others. They use the ethnic argument. So it's a form of nativism. That's why I consider Brothers of Italy as a form of far-right political party. Although, as also Casmud pointed out, even in the cases of far-right political parties, we can find some populist elements. So, and these were my answers. Thanks so much, Antonio. Thanks indeed.
Okay, great. Thank you both. So we're now open for questions. So if anyone has a question or a comment they wish to make, please send that to me via the chat. So Giuseppe, I have a question. We've also received one question already. So let me just pose those to you. So the question we received is from Shmuel Yerushalmi, who says, before we go to fight against populism, I want to ask you, is it according to you that all forms and types of populism are bad and that we must fight against them, or does it matter, right? And so if I could maybe add a little bit to that, you know, I think most, at least when I think of populism these days, I know Italy's a little bit different because the 5-star has some left-wing stuff, but in most places it is a kind of right-wing populism that we see. And so I wonder if your concerns track equally well with a more left-wing type of populism. So that's one question. The second question, which I suppose is related, is, you know, it seems like, again, just speaking generally, because I don't know nearly as much about Italy, of course, as you do, but it seems like part of the reason why populism appeals to people today, say, more than it would have, say, 30 or 40 years ago, is the sense of kind of alienation, or kind of growing economic inequality, kind of distrust of markets, right? That all of that is somehow rigged in favor of certain elites. And so the issue I think that arises is that there are, and you do this very nicely in your book with respect to other issues, I think maybe less so with this issue, is that kind of the populist response to that tends to take on a kind of nativist, angry, essentialist sort of tone, even though some of the underlying concerns are actually quite legitimate. So when it comes to, what we might call this kind of critique of neoliberalism, how does kind of continental Europe, post-authoritarian constitutionalism of the kind that I think you advocate for, how does it respond to that? That is to say, how does it respond to the real, I think, real economic critique, right? And the real kind of, certain people have really done very well the last few years and the rest of us have been left behind kind of critique. Is that a challenge to post-fascist constitutionalism in Europe, or is it something that you think it can deal with?
Thanks. Should I respond immediately as you prefer? Okay, so
sorry,
thanks so much.
I muted myself. Yeah, we're waiting for more questions, so please go ahead.
All right, so thanks indeed. First of all, I consider populism as also Canavan, I think, wrote a sort of shadow of democracy. So you always have populism in democracy. Because the democracy is a pluralistic and it gives voice, to those who don't share, some concepts. So in this sense, that I think that populism is not bad per se. As I said, it offers a sort of window of opportunity to rediscover the constitutional theory concept and to reinforce, I would say, our democracy. So this applies to right-wing and the left-wing populism. As you correctly said, the Five-Star Movement, more recently is exhibiting, some sort of left-wing identity. So it's also trying to cannibalize actually the electorate of the Democratic Party. So it is trying to, rediscover this place in Italian politics. And that's true. So I think that populism as such, or populism as such, can always offer instruments to improve democracy. That's why I don't think that they are necessarily bad, but we shouldn't accept the temptation of renouncing the role of constitutional law and constitutionalism. I think that this is crucial. And what I don't buy there is in there the constitutional counter-narrative is this majoritarian approach, which inevitably ends up in actually losing the protection of minorities, which is, as Hans Kelsen had pointed out, and in this sense, Kelsen is still a powerful antidote against this Schmittian flavor. Protection of minorities is an essential component of democracy, and that's why we need a constitutionalism. I always cite the powerful reference of the Canadian Supreme Court about secession, in which the court clarified that a constitutionalism shall be seen as an added value to democracies. And it brings, some of the democratic claims, to a further level. So, I don't buy the, dichotomy they construct. As for the second point, it is another very good and tough question. So thanks indeed. I think that there is a lot of continuity between the previous, waves of populism and the current wave of populism. I don't think that populism is over. There is a lot of continuity. For instance, populists don't like the idea of mediation. However, thanks to the new technologies, and thanks to the use of social media platforms, populists have managed to question in a more radical manner the role of parliaments. This is what we could call, computercracy, which is not the democracy at all, as Norberto pointed out. So social media platforms emphasize the polarization, the radicalization, and that's how they favor, the emergence of this mounting distrust. But I do agree with you. This new wave of populism has benefited from some flaws, in the way in which the EU, I mean, dealt with the economic crisis. And I think that a season of austerity presented many mistakes. But I think that the European Union is learning from that. That's why now the EU is investing a lot of energy and money in creating a sort of social pillar to compensate, to remedy that, since they realized that austerity actually favored the emergence of these new forms of populism. And something similar had actually happened after the First World War. I mean, the austerity approach also, I mean, favored the emergence of forms of totalitarianism. So we should learn, I mean, from our mistakes, and I think that the EU is trying to indeed, I mean, deal with this. So thanks indeed for your comments.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions, so if it's okay with you, I'll just ask you a couple more questions. So one actually goes back to that period. Is there a degree to which the current populists kind of learn from the fascist period? So is Mussolini, for instance, somebody who still has valence with these groups, and is he sort of seen as someone to be emulated either by the public or by these folks? I'd be very interested to know that. And then I want to push you a little bit on the parasitism. Oh no, sorry, the mimetism point, which is, I see the argument that there's a kind of selective use of kind of constitutional text, or I mean, I'm thinking of the quote from Conte at the UN where he talked about popular sovereignty. But I'm wondering, sort of, at some level, it is just politics, though, right? In the sense that, you're always trying to kind of make the arguments that you think will win. I think if you're kind of misquoting the Constitution, or, kind of making things up, that's another matter. But sort of, I don't know, it seems to me that kind of selective use of things that are useful to you, to me, strikes me as not that different from just politics as usual, right? So if you have a certain political agenda, certain parts of the Constitution will be more favorable to you perhaps than others. And so I was wondering if I could push you a little bit to kind of draw that line. So where is it beyond politics as usual, right? When does it become problematic to kind of selectively pick constitutional text for this purpose?
Thanks indeed. Well, first point, as Umberto Eco, I mean, once wrote, what he called the eternal fascism, as considered that, I mean, populism as one of its pillars. So Umberto Eco, I mean, identified in the populist component an important element of this form of eternal fascism that, in a way, I mean, it was still characterized our country, and not only our country. Scholars, especially the political scientists, tend to distinguish between fascism and populism. For instance, I mean, stressing the use of violence in fascist, I mean, context. But I think that populism can be, in a way, be seen as a sort of bridge that might lead, I mean, a democratic contest to a sort of fascist, I mean, a sort of fascist, I mean, in a way, regression, if you want. So, so I see a lot of continuity, although, of course, I mean, the use of violence is an important difference. Concerning your second point, I do agree, but don't forget that, and that actually, thanks for your question, because you, I mean, give me the opportunity to stress this point. I forgot that. Thank you. That Giuseppe Conte is a private law professor, is a contract law professor, so he's a jurist. So when he was mentioning, I mean, Article 1 of the Italian Constitution, he did that on purpose. And the same can be said to a certain extent, although there are many differences, with regard to a President Sayed in Tunisia, if you want. He also claims to be a constitutional lawyer. Then he abused the emergency power to pay the way for a new constitution, which is far away from the beautiful achievements of the previous constitution. So, looking at the background of this political figures, we can see that actually there is, in my view, a strategic use and instrumental use of constitutional law, which is part of a strategy. And the same thing, in my view, can be said with regard to Orban. Orban clearly, belongs to the elite, but it wants to present itself as part of the real people. Berlusconi, to a certain extent, is another example. So they know the constitution of their country, of the country that they are running, and I think that in this sense, they are paving the way for the emergence of a sort of identitarian public law. Then we could discuss about the latest let's say season of the five-star movement. Conte changed a lot this movement. It has transformed, he has transformed the movement into a more traditional political party, so he has changed also his political views to a certain extent. But I think that this instrumental use of constitutional law is part of a design, let's say. So they do that on purpose, by design. Thank you very much.
All right, interesting. Antonia, do you have anything to add on that, or anything else?
Yes, so there is a question that always comes to my mind when talking about the five-star movements in particular. So my question is, so when a populist movement go to come in power, as is elected and as responsibility of government, so these can this affect? It's confrontational, it's anti, yes, it's antagonist approach, because when you are in power, you have to deal, to govern for everyone. So is this event something that may affect the approach of populist government? So we have seen this during our experience during the Conte government. That once he was nominated prime minister, he starts to talking to all the people in a very accommodating way. So it's lose its confrontational approach. So can this event change the nature of a populist movement?
Thanks, Antonia. Well, yes, of course. When they are in power, they have to deal with real politics. So, of course, they realize that many of the announcements they made during their electoral campaign cannot be achieved or realized. So it is true. But in a multi-level contest, what the populists frequently do is trying to find another enemy, which can be the EU. Sometimes, although as you correctly said, in the very last part of the second Conte government, actually the EU has been seen as a kind of polar star. For the Conte government, thanks thanks to the next generation EU, which represented a huge opportunity. But if you also think of the American context, I mean, Trump, I mean, didn't pronounce, I mean, this search for the enemy, either internally, say, domestically, and externally. The virus was defined as the Chinese virus. The WTO was bad because of the restrictions and constraints imposed. And so, as you can see, I mean, they always try to, I mean, identify an enemy. And an enemy is always welcome when you have to create a sort of glue, I mean, connecting all the community. So, I mean, if they perceive that they can, in a way, enlarge, I mean, their voting the constituencies, I mean, by identifying a common element, a common enemy, they're going to do that. I mean, and this is what also Conte at a certain point, I mean, did it with the virus, I mean, to a certain extent. So we would say that for some aspects, the fact that they're in power is going to, I mean, tame some antagonistic, I mean, characters of these movements. But on the other hand, they're always in a permanent, in a sort of permanent intellectual campaign. They always need to mobilize, and that's why they always need an enemy, and they will find it, I'm sure, I mean, elsewhere. If it is not, I mean, the domestic enemy would be an external enemy, you know. This is what I think. Thanks, Indet.
If I may add the question, so just the last one, I promise. So do you see any difference between left-wing populism and right-wing populist party?
Sure. There are the important differences, and that's why in my book I try to clarify that my study focuses on post-totalitarian constitutionalism in Europe, because of course, I mean, left-wing populism, as also the political scientists have noted, is in a way, at least in theory, more pluralistic. So it is less exclusionary. If you look at Evo Morales, for instance, he tried to include, I mean, even indigenous people in this concept of, in this popular concept he was trying to, I mean, construct in order to base his power on that. But even there, I mean, you have this the dichotomous approach. You have this instrumentalization of the moral argument. So this permanent contestation of the external constraints. So you have many elements that, in a way, have led the political scientists to come up with a sort of unitary, I mean, concept of populism. But I'm clarifying that because, of course, the answer to the such question, how can we read the relationship between populism and constitutionalism, depends very much also on the kind of constitutionalism and populism we have in mind. I adopted the thick version of constitutionalism. Mark Tashnet and Bugaric instead adopted a thin version of constitutionalism. Anna Michaela Alterio, in her fantastic works on Latin America, understood the populism in a different manner. That's why we are giving different answers to, I mean, similar questions. But that's the beauty of comparative law, right? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Antonio, if you have another question, you're more than welcome to ask, because we have 15 minutes left. Okay, Giuseppe, maybe I can ask you one last question. If anyone in the audience has a question, please do feel free to send it in. I wanted to ask you a little bit. So one of the things I really like about your book is it's a sort of rare constitutional law book that takes politics seriously and sort of takes like the what should we say, the effort to win elections seriously. So it's not just about kind of setting up rules and having courts strike things down. It's actually trying to persuade people to vote for you, right? And the idea is some of these populist ideas are actually good, and it's for the more kind of constitutionalist parties to actually adopt these ideas. And I think that's terrific. having said that, again, as a kind of general comment, because I don't know enough about Italy to say about that specifically, one of my observations about populism, and one of the reasons that I think populists have been quite successful, is that they tend to have very strong support among usually not a majority, but a plurality of people. And then the electoral system allows them to win, right? So if you have a parliamentary system with a first past the post kind of way to count the votes, right? You can win like 35 to 40% of the vote and win the election. This is what happened for Narendra Modi in India, is what happened for Boris Johnson in the UK. And I'm sure, I think something similar probably with Orban. I don't really know about Italy, you can tell me. Similarly, Donald Trump, he didn't even have a majority of the votes in the Republican primary. He just had more than the other guys. And the key was his people were super into him, right? And in a similar way, I think a lot of these populists, there's a small group that really resonates, that these people really resonate for. And so is the ultimate solution just kind of better elections? So something like ranked choice voting, or like a well-run system of proportional representation? That is, I totally take the point that we should try to convince people otherwise, but it does seem that one of the ways they win is not even really democratic. It's that they just appeal so strongly to a big enough group that they're able to kind of get around the way elections are structured. So anyway, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks indeed for this terrific question. And indeed, the electoral legislation and I would say constitutional law as well, I mean, can play a powerful role in trying to create obstacles. I mean, not in trying to, save the country. Sometimes. For instance, Hungary, I think, has been captured by the regime of Orban also because of how the constitution, how the Hungarian basic law has been designed. Don't forget they don't have a bicameral system, so there is a lack in terms of checks and balances. One, they captured, the chamber that they have the control, of the parliament, and also because in the Hungarian basic law there is no eternity clause. So they had the possibility of changing even the, let's say, core of the constitution. And finally, Hungary is also a unitary country, so you don't have local or regional assemblies that can represent a sort of counterpower. So, and the same applies to electoral legislation. But again, in this sense, I think that the recent book by Arato and Cohen is a very welcome contribution. We cannot defeat a populist by using legal arguments only, and that's why courts are so exposed to this form of populist backlash. We should convince the civil society. So, and the Hungarian and the Turkish examples are very telling of that. So, for instance, it is true that Orban won the latest election, thanks also to a lot of gerrymandering, but I think that the result also shows that the opponents have failed in convincing civil society of the added value of the European Union, of the added value of their arguments to the life of Hungarian democracy. So I think that the constitutional law is important, but we don't have the crystal ball, and that's why sometimes, all these very important, components are not sufficient, to challenge this new wave of populism. Thanks so much for your question.
Great. Antonio, do you have anything else? No. Okay. No, well, okay, let's just wrap up then. Thank you both so much. This was really fascinating. I felt like I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody listening did as well. So really, really appreciate it.